hello everyone. Welcome to another video on HVSBL podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Paul Middleton, and we're going to be discussing his work on martyrdom, Christian martyrdom traditions. So thank you for joining me today, Paul.
Pleasure.
Can you tell us a bit about your presentation at SBL regarding the martyrdom traditions?
Well, this year I was presenting on the role of animals in the martyr tradition, so something a bit different. Some people think that because Christians and martyrs and animals were in the arena together, dying together, that there was some kind of particular sympathy for animals among early Christians. But I suggested that really wasn't the case, because anytime there's a miraculous occurrence with the animal, it's really saying something about God or the specialness of the martyr rather than the animal itself. So there's not really animal agency there. And there's also a problem that the crowd are transformed into subhuman, animalistic beasts in their persecution. So although some people think animals have got special agency in the acts of the martyrs, I was suggesting it's unfortunately not quite the case.
What caused early Christians to have the desire to create martyrdom narratives?
Well, there was an experience of what they interpreted as persecution. Now, we now no longer think that there was much in the way of formal state persecution. Where Christians ran into trouble was with local communities, but that meant they sometimes did find themselves in front of governors and perhaps asked to perform a sacrifice. Although this certainly wasn't formal, and Christianity certainly wasn't illegal by any means. But this meant that Christians could find themselves subject to hassle and indeed sometimes death. So they needed to account for that. And of course, what they had was a crucified Messiah. And so Christians developed this idea that martyrs followed Christ's example most closely. And so martyrs ended up having a special place in early Christian tradition, becoming revered and really the forerunner of the saints. But it's that twin experience of hassle, which they interpreted as persecution, and also the model that Jesus laid down. So the martyrs were almost like other Christs.
What do we know about martyrdom in Judaism?
Oh, yeah. Well, so although there's no word for martyr in Judaism, we certainly get the phenomenon of folk dying for the law. And that really starts in the book of Daniel, where, ironically, you don't actually have anyone that dies. But this was, Daniel found its final form at a point where Jews were dying for the law under Antiochus IV in the 2nd century BC. And you get that reflected in the books of Maccabees, particularly 2nd Maccabees, where you get a much more developed idea of folk who are dying for the law. Up until that point, Jews tended to go with this Deuteronomistic idea, where if they were faithful, God would bless them. If they were disobedient, God would punish them. But when you get the best folk who are really keeping to the law, being tortured horrifically and dying, then the idea of a this world justice just falls apart. So you get this post-mortem reward, and you start to see some kind of rudimentary belief in resurrection. So folk who are keeping the law are regarded as revered in some way. And that really does feed into a kind of model for Christian martyrs, although Christian martyrdom develops in slightly different ways.
How are modern martyrs made?
Martyrs, today, of course, there's a set of criteria for who is and who isn't a martyr. So churches have got processes for martyr making. But I've suggested in my work that actually it's very difficult to define martyrs. And actually what we have is martyrs are made rather than defined through either popular acclamation or indeed the way in which someone tells their story. And so you run into this kind of issue I guess, recently with the kind of Islamist tradition of suicide bombing, where for much of the Western world, these people are terrorists, whereas you do get accounts of these deaths that very much fit a martyr trope. And that's always been, the martyr has always been a kind of controversial figure. The meaning of deaths is usually been contested in some way. And in the 3rd century, where folk who had been imprisoned but then not actually being executed were thought to have special powers to forgive sins. And you get a clash between the developing church authorities and the martyrs' alternative focuses of power. So the figure of the martyr has always been quite controversial. But really, I've argued in my work that what makes a martyr is a martyr story. So there are no real secret martyrs. If someone tells the story in a particular way, then what might be an ordinary death or even an accidental death, that becomes a martyr. And that story then has really quite a lot of power.
Who is Cassie Bernall?
Oh, Cassie Bernall. Yes. So Cassie Bernall was one of the victims of the Columbine massacre. And actually, it's obviously that's a tragic event. And after she was one of the victims, and a story emerged. Really, her mother produced a book that was called "She Said Yes," and this describes Cassie's journey into faith. And this culminated in her death, where the story emerged that the gunman had asked her if she was a Christian. She said she was, and then she was shot. So this story created a martyrdom account around Cassie Bernall. But then it later emerged that wasn't quite the story, according to the police report, that actually someone else was asked the question, and the gunman went away, and Cassie didn't actually say any of those words. So there was actually a fierce battle on the internet between folk who want to defend the Cassie martyr narrative and those who want to deny it. And I have touched on this, and to say that actually what really happened isn't that important, because what matters is the way in which the story is told. And again, that story has impacted a lot of people's lives, and again, you don't really need the martyr to be aware of what's happening for they lose control, obviously, of their story. So that's a really good example where a martyr story doesn't actually have to correspond to exactly what happened. It's that the power is in the way in which the story is told.
Mm-hmm. Who is Matthew Shepard?
So this is another example where someone who was tragically and brutally murdered is transformed into a martyr with real effects. So Matthew Shepard was a gay 21-year-old student who was murdered by two other young men, and he was left out in Wyoming, the outskirts of Wyoming, tied to a fence. And he was found the next morning, and the policewoman who found him said he looked like a scarecrow, and he was taken to hospital and died several days later. But this idea that he looked like a scarecrow resulted in imagery where he was almost crucified on this fence, which actually wasn't the way he was left, but that powerful kind of imagery developed. And while he was in intensive care, it was the National Coming Out Day, and then the National Coming Out of Homosexuality was a kind of right-wing response to that, and actually he died right at that moment. So. Because he spent so much time in intensive care, there was a lot of publicity surrounded his death, and the way in which his story is then told took on these martyr tropes. So there was masses for Matthew Shepard, the martyr. Very quickly on Time magazine, he was called a martyr, and eventually hate crime legislation was named after him. So again, now he didn't mean to die. Obviously, he didn't mean to be a martyr for the gay cause, but that is how he was remembered. And again, there's a lot of controversy over his legacy. His parents tried to confront this narrative by telling the real story. Right-wing groups obviously tried to deny he was a martyr. Other reports suggested he knew his attackers. And actually some LGBT groups were concerned about the way in which he had been desexualized, so he couldn't serve as a model for everyone. But again, it's the way the story's told. For a saint, I guess, you need a good life. But to be a martyr, all you need is a death, and the death to be then reported and told in a certain way. But that's a really good example of how the story, the narration of a death can really take on a life of its own and have real effects.
What is the Donatist controversy?
So the Donatist controversy is really a theological controvery, but one of the main ideas is that the Donatists were really quite good at being martyred, and after persecution, a lot of bishops and priests had denied the faith, or received certificates to say they'd done the sacrifice. And so after that persecution, there was how do you account for people who have left? And it was decided that folk could come back after a period of repentance, but the Donatists were way more hardline, much more rigorous about who could come in, and so this led to a split in the church. But they eventually lost. But this is again where the power of the martyr started to take second place to developing ecclesiastical structures, where bishops were the ones that were the guardians of who was saved, or who was in the church, and who wasn't. So although the martyr had been a really powerful figure in the early Christian centuries, you start to see the lessening of their power, and they're subjected to church authorities.
Who are the Scottish Covenanters?
Oh well, the Scottish Covenanters were a group who resisted the rule by the king. They believed that the church really should be in charge of its own destiny, and under I'll get my kings right. I think it's Charles II. I think it's Charles II. They were kind of hunted down, and they had meetings out in the fields. But it kind of gets they kind of caught up in the kind of battles between Scotland and England. Although actually it's not quite. It's a bit more complicated than that. But the Scottish Church is Presbyterian rather than Episcopalianism, which Charles II was trying to impose on the Church of Scotland. But these people were holding out, but they were subjected to persecution. But in the end, the cause that they were fighting for certainly won the day in the end.
I want to circle back to my beginning question when I was asking you about your presentation on damnation or salvation by beasts, animals, and agency in the Acts of the Martyrs. What is the Acts of the Martyrs?
Right, that's a good question. So the Acts of the Martyrs, as it's commonly known, is basically martyr stories in the early church. What we shouldn't we can kind of it can be a bit misleading to think that there is actually a set kind of canon of Acts. So it's basically just shorthand for a number of texts that tell stories of martyrdom accounts. and particularly the ones that crop up in our scholarship quite a lot. Martyrdom of Polycarp, the Passion of Perpetua, and so on. And there is a collection that in the 70s by Herbert Musarillo, which kind of encourages us to think about almost like a canon, but that's just a convenience. So basically, any this collection of martyr stories are included in what we call the Acts of the Martyrs.
So how exactly did the martyrdom tradition begin?
As said earlier, we had this idea of Jews who had died for the law, and so there was that tradition built into Judaism. And when Christians started experiencing what they interpreted as persecution, so of course we have the story of Stephen in Acts, they interpreted these deaths as folk following the example of Jesus most closely. And if you actually read the account of Stephen's death in Acts, it looks very like Jesus' death. There's a lot of parallels between the treatment that Stephen has at the hands of those who kill him and Jesus' trial. You can see the parallels there. And in other martyr stories, like the martyrdom of Polycarp, again, the experience of Polycarp is very like that of Jesus. So Christians start to tell these stories of exemplary figures. They become kind of heroes of the Christians. And it becomes a way of kind of policing the boundaries of identity formation. Because it was actually quite difficult to get yourself martyred in the first few centuries. But there was enough experiences of hassle, again, what they experienced as persecution, to at least have this sense of anxiety, which was encouraged. During more serious bouts of persecution under Decius in the mid-3rd century, although that wasn't particularly aimed at Christians, but a lot of Christians found themselves persecuted and imprisoned and killed. And then into the Great persecution in the beginning of the 4th century. Again, these stories start to are really circulating, again, encouraging other Christians in how they should stand up for the faith. But of course, after the empire becomes Christianized, these stories are still being told, and eventually this becomes the kind of forerunner of the cult of the saints, or kind of the ascetic movement. But then these stories are called upon again during times of conflict, such as the Reformation, where both Catholics and Protestants, who are now persecuting and executing each other, are claiming the legacy of these early martyrs for themselves. So Protestants who are executed for heresy are saying, well, we're not heretics, we're martyrs. We are persecuted and killed the same way as the true church was killed in the earlier period. And particularly in England, Reformation England, Elizabethan England, where a lot of Catholics are being executed for treason, not really for any particular religious crime. They again are saying, well, we're not being executed for treason, we're being executed for our faith. And so Catholics and Protestants in particular are fighting over the legacy of these early Christians.
Did the Christians feel a sense of like, okay, so once they took over the empire under Constantine, and especially when they gained even more power after Constantine's death, did they feel a sense of wanting revenge in a sense? Because they were persecuted, they felt they were being persecuted by like the Romans, and now they get to persecute the pagans.
Well, yeah, actually, I suppose first the first group really to experience the kind of persecuting power of the church is actually other Christian groups like the Donatists.
That's ironic.
Yeah, so it's indeed it's internal, and the Donatists, of course, claim that they are martyrs. But Augustine famously says that it's not the death, but it's the cause that makes the martyr. And of course, it was Augustine and his group that get to determine what the cause would be. Later the Christians start to persecute Jews and pagans, which by pagan I just mean a non-pejorative word for non-Christians or Jews. Occasionally you get acts of violence, and sometimes emperors. Theodosius basically tries to sort out a controversy where a synagogue has been destroyed, and Ambrose famously writes to him and says, "Well, if you do anything about this, you'll give the Jews a great victory over the church, and in any case, we will disobey and we will be made martyrs. And then what's Christ going to say to you come the day of judgment?" So you've got martyrdom used as a kind of manipulative tool, even over the emperor. But yes, Hans Küng very give a kind of biting critique where he says, the church forgot that it had been persecuted, and once it has the power of the state behind it, it does start this kind of campaign. And again, this of course is what happens at the Reformation as well. Leading up to the Reformation, heretics, so-called heretics, are tried and burnt at the stake, and eventually some of them take on the mantle of being martyrs, most famously the Hussites and Jan Hus in the 15th century, the kind of forerunner of the Reformation. So, unfortunately, the policing the boundaries of Christianity has involved a lot of persecution and blood, and some folk on the receiving end of that started to have stories told about them and became martyrs, ironically giving their cause a lot of power.
What are some of the most major changes in the martyrdom narrative as Christianity developed over the centuries that you think are the most noteworthy?
So the 3rd century, where you have the controversy over the lapsed, I think is really important, because that's when the power of the martyrs start to be diminished, even though they still remain important figures. The developing structures of the church diminish their power. Once the kind of the opportunity for martyrdom disappears, you get this kind of spiritualized martyrdom that results in the language being used to ascetic traditions, and so so-called white martyrdom. So the language starts to be applied to folk who aren't dying. And of course, one of the major issues is the claiming the mantle of a martyr for folk who are not even in danger of dying. Sometimes politicians will suggest that they're being martyred, or folk that are maybe losing a bit of power, or will say that they're being martyred for their own for their cause. There was an interesting it was a marriage clerk. I forgot Kim somewhere. I've forgotten her name actually, but she refused to sign the marriage license for same-sex couples, and I think she spent a few days in jail. But she claimed to be a martyr for marriage, and that was widely reported. Although she'd been married herself several times, so it was quite ironic. But yeah, so the martyr language starts to be applied to people who are not actually in danger of dying. And of course the conflict over the meaning of the deaths of Islamist suicide bombers, of course, has been a very controversial and fraught conversation within Islam and also in the wider world.
Can you talk about martyrdom perspectives, how one culture that will view the martyrs that died for their cause positively versus the other ones that were responsible for the martyr's death will feel negative towards them?
Yeah, so you get this both in the Donicist period, but the Reformation is probably a good place where you see this being worked out. So after Hussites were killed after a trial, they were immediately proclaimed as martyrs, and so there was a procession down the streets, but the authorities clamped down on this, and it actually became punishable by death to declare that Johann Huss was a martyr. This is the point is in order to be a martyr, you have to give someone to kill you, and of course, if this is an intra-Christian conflict, then those who are carrying out the execution are going to legitimize it. That is, and so they're not going to concede that that's a martyrdom account. So, in the same way as in the Roman arena, the Christian kind of context, Romans would view the death of these criminals as justice being dispensed, whereas the Christians would see these same deaths as brave martyrs engaged in a cosmic conflict and overcoming Satan through their martyrdom. But this controversy over seeing the same death being interpreted in different ways, it becomes really quite interesting when it's groups of Christians killing one another. And of course, again, these kind of accidental martyrs. There was one in Iran during the recent protests. A woman called Neda Sultan was shot and killed, and her death was actually recorded on social media. And she was immediately declared to be a martyr. Now, she wasn't actually taking part in the protest. She was caught up in a traffic jam, and she was caught by a stray bullet. But the fact that her death was recorded online led to the hashtag, I am Neda, and such was the power of that martyr story that the Iranian government actually banned mourning for her, and her burial had to take place in private. So, again, the controversy over the meaning of these deaths are really quite dislocated and divorced from the actual what the individual thought they were doing, because no one can control their own story.
So, my final question to you is, what do you want readers to take away from the martyrdom tradition? What are you trying to show people about it specifically? Well,
I think it's building on from that last point. I think even in kind of scholarly traditions, there's been a history of trying to kind of control the meaning of martyrdom. So, some of the earliest attempts were to separate what folk thought were legendary accounts from more historical accounts. I think scholarship now sees, in general, that most of these accounts are largely fictitious. I mean, people certainly were executed, but these deaths, these martyrdom accounts are really stories that give an account of a conflict, a much wider conflict. So, although the surface story seems to be about a martyr and a persecutor, whether that's in the early centuries or whether that's a modern story, but what tends to happen is that there is a kind of proxy for a much greater conflict that the community sees themselves in. So it's a way of enforcing group identity by telling stories about their conflicts with those outside. But the crucial thing is the way the story is told. The death is the happy ending. It's the power of the martyr is not so much in the individual. A death is transformed into a story that says something about a group, whether it's religious or secular indeed, and their way of viewing the world through this conflict with others.
And I just want to tell everybody real quick that I'll have a link to Paul Middleton's book in the Amazon affiliate link in the description below and the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.